Warning: the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, let's move then from the police. Did the defense and themselves, did they start to put on witnesses when it switched over to their opportunity?
They did. They had a few witnesses that were friends of the defendant. And there were a couple people that testified that he was a very even-keeled guy, did not have a temper, was dependable. And then they did have one witness that when he testified, I guess the attorneys, they interview people before trials, and the defense attorney had interviewed him about saying that, you know, he saw the defendant do this or not do this. And then when he got up to testify, his statement was, "I don't remember." And he kept saying, "I don't remember, I don't know." And the defense attorney got very angry with him because she said, "You said that you would testify to this fact, and now you're saying you don't remember?" And that was kind of an awkward feeling because you could sense the tension.
Sure. Understandably. I mean, again, the defense attorney's got a job to do, and they think they've got that lined up, and somebody pulls that rug out at the last minute. I can understand that completely. Did the defendant testify?
He did not.
Yeah, that's rare when they do. That's rare when they do. Well, did they bring anybody on to try to alibi him or anything that was actually like direct testimony to work against the prosecution case?
They did. They had, again, some more friends. They actually, I think it was his current girlfriend who was there and mentioned what a, nice guy he was, and he would never do anything like this. But you were getting the sense that, you didn't really hear any concrete things. It was just, yeah, he's a nice guy, he does this. But then we also learned one of the people who testified, I can't remember who it was, that mentioned about, he was a good dad. And then they followed it up with the defense about, oh, he's a father, can you tell us about his kids and stuff? Apparently, he had, at the time, 8 children by 8 different women.
Did the jury take a signal from that? Do you think it without going into too much detail, because we don't want to talk about direct things said in the deliberation room. Did you have an impression that affected his credibility?
Well, of course, that doesn't say whether or not he, did or didn't. It has nothing to do with the actual, did he murder this? And that's what you had to get past. But, it sounded like, well, maybe he's not very dependable, as other people were saying, because he'd had these other misdemeanor convictions. But, you kind of look at character, but of course that doesn't have anything to do with the murder. But you kind of start thinking and looking and going,
Did that testimony come out during a defense examination or with the...
It was defense.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. That's a different tactic. Different. I would just say that sounds kind of risky, but I'm not them. So maybe they were trying to make it look like he had that much responsibility to take care of.
Right. And that's why he was a hardworking person.
There we go. Okay. That's where they were headed. But I think that sometimes that's a razor's edge, because it can also lead to different impressions. Right, wrong, or indifferent. They're there.
Right.
They're there.
Yeah, I think that that wouldn't have been a positive light had I heard that. You would just think, I don't know that I would say great dad. That almost borderlines professional dad if you've got 8 kids by 8 women. But yeah, I think that would have, for me, and this is just my opinion, that would have probably shown a very negative light for me. I would have thought, wow, that's a lot.
Right.
But, I guess that was their strategy with that. So you hear these different witnesses coming on and speaking, and I've always wondered, and I'm not trying to jump ahead, but at what point, when you all go back to the deliberating room, I guess it is, I've always wondered when you watch shows and they go back to the jury room or they say jury, came out after 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 days, whatever it is. I always thought, do you just go back to this table and sit down and say, well, what do y'all think? I've always wondered because I've not done it. Is there a method to it, or do you all just kind of say, hi, my name's Wendy. I think he's guilty. Or I've just wondered that. How does that happen?
Well, before we get in the room, because I do want to get there too, and those are perfect. That's exactly what, and God, I can't wait to get there.
Right.
But a couple of housekeeping things. Did you ever have that thing like people see on TV where somebody yells, I object? Did that happen a lot?
Oh, yes, a lot.
Okay, yeah. And I know what happens is they go to the bench usually and talk about it. When they're up or talking, how does that feel? Do you, like when they just yell that and then you don't hear what's going on, but everybody gathers and it's like a little whispery thing. From the jurors thing, what's that feel like when they do that?
Well, you wonder, really, what are they talking about? First of all, like, what are they actually objecting to? Is it the statement, the question? What is it? And then it kind of just gives you a second to kind of readjust yourself in your chair, and people are kind of looking at each other, kind of either rolling their eyes or like,
I love it. Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Did they give you breaks frequently, or is it?
We did.
Yeah.
But it was right at almost 2 weeks of testimony.
That's about right for here in town. In California, the 2 weeks would be a preliminary hearing at O.J. Simpson, but but here that's about right. Now, did they ever sustain or look over and say strike that or disregard that last?
You were going to take my question. We think too much alike.
Well, you go ahead and ask it if it make you feel better.
Well, my question is when they say strike that, and I've always wondered, you're not me. Forget that question. You're not going to forget that question.
Right. But you're not supposed to, or the answer, you're not supposed to make that as part of your notes. Like if you're writing something down, it's like, well, you got to scratch that out. Then they walk over to the court reporter and they go over there and have them delete whatever they've typed.
But I would have to think that part of that would still linger in your mind, even though you're supposed to strike it.
Right. You're saying, well, why did you object to that?
Yes. I wouldn't let it go. I'd keep thinking about it. No, I'll never get called.
I've wondered the same thing. Even when I was on the stand and they did it, I'm sitting there thinking, what do they think over there about that? And we don't know all the time. There was a couple times I knew what they were at the bench for, and because especially if it involved me on the stand, you kind of pick that together. But at the same time, you're like, what? Who could? And I'm not saying to do this, but who really could let that go? I mean, it's a human nature thing, and it adds some mystery to it. That's always like that must have been good stuff if they don't want you to talk about it.
I'm definitely holding that in my brain.
Yeah, that's called a grudge. I've got that. Yeah, I just barely drew over it with my pen so I can read. Fascinating because again, people that have never sat in that room to have that on TV, we see it, but it's real. They go to the bench frequently, and they're all trying to, we've talked before, they're trying to protect the record. That's what this is about, is both sides are trying to protect the record. I can tell you that a frustration from police when they're testifying is if the going gets tough and you have somebody really working you over, a lot of police will get frustrated with the prosecutor because the prosecutor will not intervene. And after a while, you're almost like, hey, jump in, and anytime you want to jump in. But I think Ray, the DA, even talked one time before that you don't always run in and rush into that aid and everything for a couple of reasons. I think one is if they're being excessively brutal, the jury probably needs to see that. And I think the other thing, too, is with Ray Larson and his staff is you're learning the whole time you're up there. Trust me, is that they cared enough to let you experience that. But boy, there were a couple of times early on in my career that I was like, anytime y'all want to start saying object and get them off my back, I'll go along with it. But it's not that's not the reality for us. But I'm glad you talked about that. And I'm glad you asked, Winnie, because that's exactly what people are thinking. Because they're like, the hell, I'm going to disregard that. That was hot stuff.
Right.
So
Yeah.
The truth is, if it's really messed up, it's a mistrial. But the reality of it is because that's another thing too. Like, for example, if you're testifying and they're like, well, how did you encounter Wendy Faircloth? And I'm like, well, I recognized her as she was currently wanted for, and boom, hammer goes, somebody yells, and that's a mistrial because I can't talk about the fact that she was wanted. So it's a minefield that way, but that's good stuff.
Right. And like you said, that because you're not allowed to know on a jury other than misdemeanor convictions, anything about their past. So we didn't know until, like I mentioned afterwards, that there was not only the one rape indictment he had, but we found out just a couple of weeks later, there was a second one.
Yeah. Look, when we circle around back to the verdict, let's bring that up again, because I've got to, for me, that would be a validator probably, even though it's not part of the thing, but for the emotional part of what you carry. Well, that said, Wendy's sitting here strapped under her time machine, ready to take us back in the deliberation room. So how do you wind up back there? What do they do before you go back to deliberate? Is it, I guess, the closing arguments, all the witness statements and everything?
Right. We had that, and that's when we had the family statements from both sides. Then they kind of gave just a synopsis, both sides. And both were saying this is why, because this was presented this way. This is why you should find them guilty, or this was presented like this, and because the police were ineffective in doing this and this and this, then you can't convict.
Right. We're fair game. I'll be the first. I've said it before. We're fair game, and that's a strategy that can work. You only need one. That's what people don't realize. You just need one. So I guess now, before they send you back, we talked a little bit about this, and I really want to hit it pretty hard. The instructions. Do they send you back with a mission statement and tell me what that sounded like and what that was and what you thought of it when you got it?
Right. It was, we were each given a few pieces of paper that were stapled that had, if you find this defendant guilty of murder 1, this is what the criteria is for murder 1, or murder 2, wanton murder, and it went down the list. And then as with the sodomy charge too. When you look at that, each charge, all the wording in that is very, I guess you would call it legalese, very wordy. It was almost a full page on each thing. What qualifies as murder 1? And when we got in there, it was very, to try to interpret it. Does this qualify as this? And that's where we kind of got into, not getting too far ahead, that's where we kind of got into some of our discussions and deliberations.
Exactly. They're confusing. And when you said legalese, it is. I mean, that's the pinnacle right there, is that you're reading from the statutes, the laws themselves on what the things are to have that. And I do know that there's a limit on how much they can explain that to you. Kind of like with the whole thing with reasonable doubt, is that if either side goes too far, is it starts to become interpretive and whatever. So that's a challenge. And again, those elements of those offenses are so specific, right?
Right.
That it takes that, because you'll see people to this day say, well, they should have got murder 1. They should have, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, no, that there's a thing called elements. And your conversation is, if you're not in that range of elements to even be considered, it's not even a possibility.
Right. And if we had questions, there were only certain things we could ask, because we would come to a point we needed the bailiff, who was our communicator, to take the questions to the judge. And they would come back and say, oh, we can't really answer that. You need to refer to these 2 paragraphs.
There we go. So they send them back to school. Yeah. So they charge you with those things. And then let's take it from where Wendy left off. Is it you go to the room that we all see on TV in the movies. And what happens back there?
Well, it's a conference room, at least this in the courthouse we were in. A conference room. It did have the male, female bathrooms. And that was about it. And you had new pads and pencils. And before we actually started deliberations, because I believe the closing arguments ended at about 4:00 on an afternoon. And they said, well, it's going to be a long night, so we're going to order dinner. What do you all want? So we actually voted on that. We had 2 or 3 choices on dinner, and everybody came up with parquet.
Good choice. Randy Kaplan. Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
he's a good friend of mine.
So we had parquet.
Yeah, exactly. Good choice. And I guess they were warming you up to working together to come up with a decision.
Right.
What a way to start. Well, did you have to pick like a spokesperson or a leader or anything like that?
They did have a 4-person that we selected. He was a retired teacher. Of course, nobody really wanted to do it, because you're the one that's going to, when they say, has the jury reached the verdict? You're the one, I don't want anybody coming after me or anything. So we let him and being a teacher, I don't know, he had kind of a little more of a, presence of standing up in front of everybody and talking and getting questions. And what do you think? What do you think?
Good. That's a good natural kind of team dynamic.
Or controlling the crowd when they don't listen.
Yeah.
Sit down.
Exactly. Too good. Well, that kind of fell together wonderfully then. Because sometimes you hear stories of how that gets to be kind of an issue, but somebody kind of naturally fill in that role. That's pretty good.
Right.
So if you get your po' boys and whatever you got, the chicken's really good. By the way, we'll plug Parquet thoroughly for they just to let people know the owner is a former police officer that I worked with.
Maybe
for
he'll
years.
give us a free meal for giving a shout out to him.
No, not Randy.
We love Parquet, and he's a great singer.
I'll
by
take
the
the
way.
fries.
Yeah. You may get a few. You said he sings good. We'll probably get some chicken.
He
Exactly.
is a good singer.
No,
he
he
plays
is.
guitar and he sings in different places. He's a great singer.
He was a great detective too. So you get back and you select.
Well,
this
I have to ask.
Yeah.
You know, I like to break things down by piece and piece. So while you're waiting on the dinner, is it just casual, or do we just go right on and start digging into why we're here?
Well, we decided how to approach it first. Which charge do we take first? And then saying we need to really interpret these instructions because everybody was really confused by it. And everybody, some people got up and went to the bathroom. They said, I just need to clear my head. I just need some quiet time, in the corner of the room because there was really no place you could go. Because we knew that it was coming down to this. So that's how it kind of all started. And then as we were eating, is when we kind of started talking about, okay, we're going to take this one first. Let's interpret it. Do we have a vote? We discussed, we all recapped the case to kind of make sure that we all agreed on this is what we heard. Or you didn't hear this, or, about this part of the investigation was right. They did this. They did not do this. This is this evidence. How do you feel? So everybody kind of agreed on the timeline and what happened. Then we discussed it a little bit. And then that's when we took our first vote.
Did it feel like was there a consensus starting to come together on the first vote, do you think?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And again, we can't get into too much detail back there because I really think we got to walk carefully. But did you get a sense that there were more dominant personalities coming out in the room, or did you have people that were maybe slower coming to that consensus? Or
a little bit of both, actually.
Yeah,
there were a couple of people who were very adamant, one way, and then some other people saying, "Well, now we need to look at this. Now let's look at this, but let's back up and let's do this." And kind of start over. So kind of brought those people that were just like this, this is how I feel, down to a little more even keel so we could look at everything in every aspect.
Now, I guess that first straw vote, you said it felt like a consensus was coming in. And I like the idea that they actually started to challenge the information a little bit, step back. That's a healthy thing. I'd be worried if that didn't happen, really. About how long were you all in before you actually came to a conclusion? How long were you in that room? Did you work through the night, or did you come back in the morning? Or?
We did stay till very late that night. We had initial verdict, and then after that, we had to send a note to the bailiff, and then they wanted us to work on the sentencing, which was another set of rules and papers.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's walk through those pieces a little bit. So late in the night, you send a note saying that you've reached a verdict, and what verdict did the jury unanimously come up with?
We came up with guilty of wanton murder and guilty of first-degree sodomy.
Gotcha. So they march you all back out in the courtroom, I guess, and
yes,
and the foreperson that sounds like an incredible person to step up and do that too, by the way, goes ahead and announces that verdict.
Right.
Was there much of a response in the courtroom when that was read?
Just from the mother of the victim, I guess obviously probably relief that there was some, quote, justice for her daughter. There was no reaction from the defendant, but his sister was quite boisterous, and they had to actually take her out of the courtroom.
It's a super charged moment.
Sure.
And understandably on both sides. I could never really be too critical of that myself because the emotional charging is incredible. Because both those families waited all night. And I used to, myself, I would wait with them. I didn't care how late it went. And sometimes I went to the early hours of the morning, but that anticipation, that wait is horrible on both sides. And speaking for the the suspect's family, they love that person. That's family. That's a friend, and they're in their camp, and that's terrifying. They're losing somebody. They're watching them go through that. So that's why I ask. Sometimes you get reactions out of the crowd, and sometimes you don't. So you announce that, and what happens next?
Then the judge, asked each one of us, "Is that your true verdict?" Went through all of us. And then they filled out some papers and did some stuff. And she turned to us and says, "Now you have the sentencing phase of the trial. You have two different things to decide. The sentence on the wanton murder and the sentence on the sodomy." And of course, as you know, they talk about the mitigating and aggravating circumstances to consider that. So we went back into the room. That was probably another, I want to say 3 hours maybe.
Oh, what time in the morning were you talking about wrapping up then?
This was, it was around midnight maybe.
I got you. Okay.
Did you get more food?
Yeah, they brought us.
Because I'm thinking it's time to eat again.
Mm-hmm. They actually brought us some, was it Baskin Robbins? I'm trying to think. I don't know. They had to get it before they closed, but it was cold. So
yeah, it gets you sugared up. That's
right.
Because it might be a long night.
Right.
So the on the sentencing part, did they produce witnesses and statements and stuff before you went back to deliberate sentencing? Did anyone?
No,
Nobody
they did not.
Even on the defense?
No.
Yeah, usually there's usually somebody comes in, kind of like what you saw before. They kind of pitch hit on character and stuff like that.
Do you recall on that wanton, what are the parameters of that? What does that define? It's obviously not a murder one. What is that?
Gosh, if I can remember. A lot of it is, did they intentionally harm the victim knowing that it could cause death? I think.
It's a mental state issue. And that's you summed it up pretty well, is that it's basically that I'm going to carry with a conduct that I know could cause serious physical injury or death. And I go forward anyway. It's below intentional, to where I'm focusing on doing this, but for whatever reason, I'm going to go down this path and do that. And a lot of times, if the jury isn't comfortable with intentional, if they don't feel like that was put across real good, they'll fall back to that one because it's still a degree of murder. So, yeah, you still remembered well. So
it's been a long time.
Exactly, good deal. So you go back in the room, and then just in general, how was was everybody tired?
Oh yes, obviously physically, mentally, of course, because it's been a long 2 weeks, and we were not sequestered, but we were not allowed to talk about it with our families. Now, of course, how are you going to really control that when you go home every night? You don't know. But I did not, discuss that with my husband. I think he eventually figured it out, because what I learned later was that the media locally was covering the story. And actually, when we left the courtroom, the media trucks were outside reporting on it. At that point, I figured, wow, this must have been a pretty big case. Of course, we didn't know.
Sure. As far as being tired, because I guess the emotional pin pulled on that, they did let you go home and rest.
Right.
Before you came back and deliberated. That was probably give you a fresh battery start on that. So you're back in early the next morning, I guess. And did people have a pretty good idea where they? Here's where I want to go to. Was the death penalty now off the table?
It was.
Okay.
That was a big part of the deliberations at first, because a lot of people went back and forth with it because we knew that was a possibility. But, we felt that it met the parameters more of wanton murder.
Good. Yeah.
So that took that off the table.
Yeah, and that's what juries are for. I mean, that they're the ones that assess that. So you come back the next morning, and how was the atmosphere when you came in? As far as did people have an idea where they wanted to go on sentencing and punishment, or?
I think we still were a couple of more hours again going through each charge, because the judge had given us, it can be life without parole, it could be life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. And then the sodomy charge was another, I believe, 20 years to serve concurrently, I believe. So we had to make that decision. So those three right there. Mm-hmm.
So they in the end, did they come back and do those two concurrently on your sentences?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. That means they serve them at the same time. Is pretty much what that means, is that instead of one after the other. So that's what that comes down to.
Right.
So really, you're kind of only serving one.
Right. Yeah. It's a concurrent, and it depends on how the jury feels about it. Sometimes they'll lay it out as consecutive, and where you'll actually do that kind of calendar time that it'll add up. I think the more calendar years I got on somebody was 180 of consecutive sentencing. He's probably eligible for parole in 2 years, but that's a whole nother topic. So I guess you make that final vote come out, and any reaction on the sentencing? Did anybody in the courtroom when they finally announced the sentence?
No.
Yeah. I guess the initial shock is that guilty thing then.
Right.
Anything else about it that struck you when you were going through this? Let me ask you this. Did any of the attorneys interview any of you all after the trial to poll you, to ask any questions or anything like that?
Not the attorneys, but the judge did come back and talk to us.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Tell me about that then.
The judge came back to us and wanted to thank us for serving and just kind of ask us in general, do you look at things a little differently now that you've gone through the process as opposed to watching it on TV? Like you said, evidence is collected, convicted, and everything's done in an hour. Well, that's obviously not the way it goes. So she asked us about it, and also asked us how we were feeling as far as psychologically, because it was traumatic in a point that there were several graphic photos that we had to look at for the autopsy. And they were pretty compelling. And she asked us if we felt that any of us needed a type of counseling to help sleep, because she said a lot of times juries at murder trials have problems sleeping. Did I make the right decision? Did I not? Thinking of the families, thinking of a lot of things. So she offered us counseling and just wanted to know, did we have any different opinions about the system and the process at this point?
Pretty interesting. Yeah. And who was the judge?
Her name was Pamela Goodwine.
Yeah, fantastic. One of my favorites. We'll give a shout out to her. She's fantastic. I really like Judge Goodwine. Yeah, and that's neat that they took the time to come out and actually talk to you about that and then offer something. Because, again, you just get a summons in the mail and you go and you're propelled into all that violence and all the graphic imagery and stuff like that.
And you're asked to believe people you don't know. They're strangers to you all. And so they got to be pretty convincing to convince you of their evidence.
People make a lot of assumptions on that, I'm sure. So,
did you or anybody take the judge up on that offer for counseling, or did you personally not feel it affected you bad enough that you needed to?
I know a couple of people did.
Good.
And we also agreed that after we were free, so to speak, to go, that we could talk about the case amongst each others. Those of us on the jury, we actually got together after a couple of weeks, after kind of decompressing, and we met at the person who was the foreperson. We met at his house and had a potluck dinner.
That is awesome.
That's kind of neat. Do you all still stay in touch to this day?
Not as much. Unfortunately, I know some of the people that were on the jury have passed away. They were some elderly, and this was 2006. But a lot of us did stay in touch for quite a while. And we did get together once every couple of months just to and that first potluck was really about God, can you believe this happened? And can you believe they said this? And because we could now say that where we couldn't do that before. And how did that make you feel? Did it sway you this way or that way? Or did it make you feel stronger? Or did it change your mind about something? So we really had a lot of roundtable discussions in a sense.
That was probably pretty cathartic to handle the rough piece too.
Well, how about when you hear judges say that they don't want you to watch the news or talk about it? And I know you said you didn't talk about it with your husband, but how do you, did you just not turn on the TV? Because, if you have the TV on and it pops up, do you just turn it back off?
Right. I just walked out of the room when I knew they were doing local news. I guess that's me, kind of that journalist in me. I mean, I knew I had, an ethical
obligation.
Right. To not do that. And I wasn't going to risk it. So I didn't do it. Like I said, when my husband kind of figured out the case, he was like, wow, I can see how you would have been feeling, because this was pretty heavy.
Absolutely. It's a lot to be deciding and whatever. But, one thing too that I wanted to talk about before we started recording, we brought this up and I thought it was interesting. And I'll just tell the listeners is that I know Jayne's been involved with the Citizens Police Academy and the Citizens Police Academy Alumni Association. We're going to dig deep because those are critical, fantastic programs that I would say that if somebody out there really is interested in crime and has that interest, that your local Citizens Police Academy is the first place to beeline to. If you want an experience to take you closer to that and start to develop a relationship with people that do that. But, I'd asked Jayne before we started if you were with the CPA when you went back in the jury room, because I've always wondered how that affects people knowing more about the system. And what was neat is, tell me, you weren't, but this kind of took me off guard, and we've got to talk about this. Tell everybody how you learned of the CPA. This is a fantastic story.
Well, it was actually from Judge Goodwine. After she talked to us about if any of us felt we needed counseling, she also asked us, did this change your mind about seeing the process of a crime scene investigation and how thorough it is? And a lot of people were saying yes. And it's like, wow, it's a lot of work. You didn't realize that. Because it is more than just the 30 seconds you see on TV. And she said, well, if you're interested in learning more, there is a program here in Lexington, and it is called the Citizens Police Academy. And it's, at the time, I think 10, 12 weeks, where actual police officers, detectives come in, and they teach you different aspects of the police department and their departments. And it's presented to local citizens. And you can learn a lot about it. And I thought, well, that sounds really appealing to me, because I've always kind of been, I guess even in my youth, a closet wannabe crime person, because when I was a kid, I used to love to watch, now this gives my age away, but I used to watch a show called The FBI, and I loved detective shows, and I loved Quincy and things like that. And I just thought that sounds really cool. So she had a contact person of the name of Debbie Wagner.
We have to, Debbie is a force in and of herself. Exactly.
She is, there is no one like her, and that, you can't say that about many people, but there's nobody like Debbie. And so she was the coordinator of the program. She said, if you want to learn more about this, you can call her and she'll tell you more. And I called. There was a class coming up in a couple of weeks. So I signed up, went through the background check, and started it. And that's led to my now almost 15-year involvement with the CPA and the Alumni Association.
Fantastic. And I just love the idea that the judge came back and offered that. I just didn't know that even happened. And it's a good thing, because I know over my career, first of all, the CPA Alumni Association is like a group of friends to all of us. It was an amazing support base that was always there. As a matter of fact, me and Wendy just did a online interview a while back with the CPA. I guess it was an in-session class when we did it, I think, because a lot of people listen to the podcast, but to meet up with them. But again, the insight that you gain into what the policing is all about, because the exercises, I can tell people that they take you and let you experience what it's like to do a building search, and which is an eye opener, or what it's like when you conduct a traffic stop, and then the ride-alongs, which are incredible. Right. So I'm glad we brought that up, because it's an organization that deserves a lot of support. It's national. I'm going to have to say international. Would I be wrong in saying it's international?
No, it is international. Right. We had actually, there's a representative on the NCPAA that we have, that she's from Canada.
Okay, great. But I would recommend people to seek that out. And now that we're kind of thawing out of COVID, I would imagine more of them are going to start going back to in-person. Right. Which will be much more enjoyable, especially with the exercises. Thanks for participating, and thanks for leading it for as long as you did too. That was pretty impressive. And it helped. It made a communication. See, and here's the value again, is that what people need to understand is Jayne had no problem with reaching out and saying, "Hey, I've done this," and as soon as you told me you had been a juror on a murder trial, I was like, "Oh, this is on. It's exactly where we're going to take this podcast from time to time." So. Excellent stuff. So people out there listening should do the CPA, and then stay involved with the Alumni Association, because that's a strong support base. Right.
Because it's such a wonderful thing, because the first night of the class, you meet the chief and the assistant chiefs, how much they support the program. Then you, like you said, you break down, you learn about drugs and vice and financial crimes and other things. And it's like fascinating stuff. And sometimes the classes would just go on because everybody's asking so many questions. And again, to give a shout out to Bill Brislin and Chris Schoonover, on the nights they presented some cases, we'd be there till 11 o'clock at night. Sure. But they'd keep going because the questions kept coming, and it was like a great novel. You couldn't put it down.
Yep, exactly. That you can, and you'll get information there you won't get anywhere else.
Right.
No matter whether it's on international TV or not.
Right. And we got to do things like when you're riding along in the car and how they go on the track and you're going side to side. And that was Kevin Kidd's specialty. Yeah. Oh, people love that. They love meeting the canines, the mounted unit.
Yeah, I think chiropractors pay Kevin to drive that car. Yeah. Just because of the neck adjustments that people need after that. So
I think also it's great because people get to see the ins and outs. Most people who have not taken that CPA class don't realize such things that are involved with the police, like you said, is mounted or canine, or the thing that goes into the defensive driving, or the chief, all the way down to, to the patrolmen and the detectives. I think they just think you go in and you ride patrol and you take calls. And there's so much more to it. And that class is such an eye opener because you don't think of all the little intricate details that go together to comprise an entire department. Mm-hmm. And it is so, it really, I've taken that as well. And you just learn so much that you think, wow, I didn't know they did that. So yeah, I'm glad you did it as well.
And that's why you stay with the organization. I think that there are people that just take the class and they're like, okay, that was interesting, but I'm not really interested in pursuing it. But I didn't want to leave. I felt so strongly about the officers and what they do. You wanted to support them. And that's where the alumni, comes in to help raise money for things and to support the officers in so many ways. And that's why Debbie again, after I'd been there a few months, she's like, well, I think you need to run for office. And like, well, I was just kind of going to take the class. And she's like, no, you'd be great vice president. And then I was vice president of the Alumni Association, then moved up to be president of the Alumni Association for a couple of years. And then and I should add, tooting the horn of the Lexington CPAA, that we're the only organization in the nation that has won Best Citizens Police Academy 4 times.
That's impressive.
Wow, that is.
That's impressive.
And Debbie's won the Coordinator of the Year.
No surprise there.
Right.
Well, for what it's worth, just to remember that the appreciation that we all have and the people left behind do is incredible. It's immeasurable. Mm-hmm. And just for the times that you all have been there when we needed you, for sure. And then coming out of a joint roll call and seeing tables full of food, that's how you talk to a cop.
You love those cookouts at the range.
Exactly.
I do recall that.
Yeah.
Those are a blast.
Well, that's where we had some of the best chefs. We had Rick Willoughby and...
Amen. Yeah, absolutely. Some of the best stuff in the world.
Yes.
Thank you for coming and doing this. And I'm glad you got to meet Wendy and you met the miniature horses. That's a big thing here at the Murder Police Podcast Studio, is out back the miniature horses.
And the Wonder Cat.
Yeah, the Wonder Cat, Figaro. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he is the Wonder Cat. So I'll let Wendy close us out, and thanks again. Appreciate it.
Well, Jayne, thank you so much for coming to join us and sharing your story with us on your 2 long weeks serving on the 2005 murder case here in Lexington. I know that was such a sacrifice for you, long days, long nights away from your family. So thank you for doing that and putting so much heart and soul into it. And thank you also for coming to speak with us and share your story. I got to ask all those questions that I've wondered. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad I could do it.
The Murder Police Podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police Podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police Podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.